Welcome to the Open to Hope Show. I'm your host, Dr. Gloria Horsley, with my daughter and co-host,
Dr. Heidi Horsley.
Well, Heidi, it is so great to be with you on the show today, and we are going to have a wonderful show and talk about some interesting topics. But before we get there, I want to remind you all that Open to Hope is a nonprofit organization, and it's brought to you in partnership with the Compassionate Friends. And we also want to remind you that our word of mouth is our important thing. So we hope you'll tell all your organizations, groups, whoever you can, at least one person this week, try to tell them about Open to Hope and encourage them to come on if they've had a loss.
Absolutely, Mom. And today, like you said, we are going to have a really interesting show. We are going to be talking about replacement children. And we have two fabulous guests, Judy Mandel and Rita Battat Silverman. Judy wrote, they both are best-selling authors, and Judy has written the book Replacement Child, a Memoir, and Rita has written the book Replacement Children, the Unconscious Script, and she has a foreword by Katie Couric.
Fantastic. Well, it's such an interesting topic. I'm totally
It is, and both Judy and Rita are replacement children. So they'll be talking a little bit about what that is and how they came to be replacement children.
Fantastic. Well, welcome you two.
Thank you.
Hi, Judy,
Thank you
Rita.
so much.
Welcome to the show.
So great to have you on the show today. And you deserve a crown and a hero, because during that big snowstorm we had in New York, she and her husband came in from where?
From Connecticut.
All the way from Connecticut, had to stay for the weekend.
Yeah.
And we stayed, right till the very end. We were hoping the studio would open, and then the mayor closed the whole city.
Yep.
And you guys were locked in here in New York.
We were.
For the big snowstorm.
The empty streets.
Yeah, it was incredible. Well, Judy, let's start with you and talk about your story a little bit, because it's such an interesting story about, well, maybe we could talk to you both for a second about what replacement children are. Do you want to mention that? And we'll have Rita.
Sure. Actually, I think I would like Rita to take that
Okay,
on.
Rita.
This is kind of important because replacement children and replacement child is actually a syndrome. And that's why we use that name. It doesn't mean that anyone is replaceable, because they absolutely aren't.
Right.
So replacement child is what happens if someone hasn't really, you never complete grieving, but has processed it to the point where another child is not put upon to fill that void. They can still be who they are. And I just want to really emphasize that a child born after a loss is not a replacement child and should not be called one. A child adopted after a loss is not a replacement child. If you are adding to the family, if you're adding to the family and not, it's instead of, then you have a replacement child. Okay.
Well, we'll probably delve into that a little bit after. Let's talk to Judy for a second and talk about your story.
Sure.
And then we'll get into a little bit more about ideas about what kind of expectations for kids too after they're born, after a child dies in the family, and for some kids. I mean, this isn't a total, this is the way it is. This is something very interesting to explore. And so tell us about your story to start with.
Well, to start out, I had no idea about the term replacement child when I started writing my book.
And it's a memoir.
It is a memoir. And when I started writing it, I really didn't even know it was my story. I thought it was my parents' story, my sister's story of a plane crash that crashed into my parents' house and killed their 7-year-old daughter and badly injured my other sister, who was 2 at the time. I was born a little less than 2 years later.
Wow.
And in looking at the term replacement child and finding the syndrome of replacement children, I began to identify with it and see that a lot of the indications for what was being termed replacement child were applied to me.
How did you first hear that term?
I was doing some research and I came upon...
Because you are an author and a coach and all that.
Yep. I came upon the term from, I think it was 1964, was the Cohens, I think, was the group that, the psychologists that had coined it. And a lot of it was to do with children of the Holocaust. That was one of the things that they were looking at. And it was mostly children that were born after the death of another child. As Rita says, it's not always that way. It was a term that was used then, and since it resonated with me so much, that's how I got the title of the book.
Well, we've
and
got
started looking into it.
We've got a little rolling clip about your family, and then I would like you to tell tell our audience a little bit more about them. But if we could see the clip now, that would be great. And and let's give what year was it that the airplane?
1952.
Okay,
And it was a series of 3 crashes, and in a period of 3 months that happened at the time. And there was a lot of mystery kind of around that back in 1952,
Right.
when planes, air travel was new.
Yeah,
for people.
and they crashed into your home in New Jersey.
In Elizabeth, New Jersey. Right.
Incredible.
Right.
Yeah. So.
I wrote Replacement Child to tell the story of my family, to bear witness to their incredible strength and fortitude, and ultimately to find my role in that story. But in the writing, the story evolved into much more. It delves into the relationship of a husband and wife after the death of their daughter, when a plane crashes into their home, and how they rally for the intense care that surviving daughter needs, and how they decide to have another child, in an effort to heal the family and rebuild a sense of normalcy. Being that replacement child turned out to be a weight that I didn't even realize I was carrying until writing the story, or how it had affected the rest of my life. When I started the book, it was with a sense of responsibility to my parents, who had both died that year. I heard their voices in my head telling me not to let their story go untold. My sister Linda was still alive through the 4 years of the writing, and I would check in with her for accuracy and fact-checking, and she wound up revealing some of the secrets that she was privy to, and that I, as the little sister, was not.
Oh wow, powerful!
That's unbelievable.
Yeah, an incredible story.
Very powerful.
It is.
Yeah, really. Well, talk about your sister, because she was burned in the accident.
She was.
too.
She was burned very badly. They didn't think she would live through that. It was kind of touch and go, 50-50 chance they gave her. And she was in and out of hospitals every year, as far as I remembered. Every year she would go to the hospital to have something fixed.
And she had significant scars.
Significant, yeah.
I remember seeing her picture, and I
Yeah.
love how you said
Yeah.
she was the strongest person you'd ever met.
Well, she was. She was.
Unbelievable.
It's a difficult road to go when your scars are on the outside.
Right.
We all have them somewhere, and she was very brave.
So, how did you hear about this story? Do you remember when you first heard it? How did your family handle this whole story? And I know you said your dad had some problems with you.
Yeah, well, they didn't talk about it, and it was almost assumed that I knew everything without really knowing anything.
Wow.
They would light a candle for my sister's yard every year, but they never told me what it was, and that it was for her.
Wow.
They never talked about the crash, and I think it was intentional not to talk about it. My dad never talked about my sister Donna, who was killed. My mother did, though, eventually start talking about her, and with happy memories, she would talk about her. I learned more really later on when I started doing the research for the book, and that was after they had died. I kind of regret that I didn't get to talk to them more about it when they were alive. But what are you going to do?
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
That's the way they left me. They left me notes, and they left me all of the
Your
newspaper
mother was going to
articles.
write about it, right?
My mother tried to write about it many times. I have reams of yellow, pads where she tried to write the story, and it really, couldn't get beyond the actual day of the crash.
Well, did she talk about that? So do you have her talking about how it was and
I
getting
do.
your sister
I do.
out and all that kind
Yeah,
of thing?
that I have the specifics of,
Right.
because she did detail it. How she didn't know what the crash was. She thought the oil burner had blown up.
Wow.
And how my older sister, who was killed in the crash, yelled that she saw the baby was on fire. She said, "The
my
baby's on
God.
fire.
Oh my
Go
gosh.
get the baby." So she did. She went and got the baby, and she rolled her down the stairs in a blanket.
Wow.
And that's what saved her.
Incredible.
But she couldn't get back up to
Well,
that
Rita,
your
let's
sister-
talk about, now your brother died before you were born.
Right. I was born 18 months after a 14-year-old brother had a heart condition and died.
Uh-huh.
And at that time, there were no surgeries.
Right.
Now it could be fixed
Yeah, I
easily.
know my nephew died the same way, and they were waiting for the surgery because, because the surgery was coming around. People knew that there was going to be the surgery. But so he had a heart
He had a heart condition. And
And
like,
what was his name?
his name was Bobby.
Mm-hmm.
Like Judy, I had never heard of replacement child. I had no clue. And then one day, I was talking to another mother, and she had 3 children, and one child was treated very differently. And she mentioned, she said, this isn't my first child. This was her oldest child. She said, this wasn't my first child. My first child was diagnosed as an infant with leukemia. And the doctor said, you're going to lose this baby, go home, get pregnant, you're going to have another child. And so we did that. Of course, no grief counseling or anything. And so this baby died like literally 10 days before the next child was born. And she said she was just paralyzed. She said as much as they wanted another child, she was coming home from the hospital with a child she didn't know, not that it wasn't the child she wanted. And she said, I know, I didn't treat this child the way I treated the other children. I couldn't think right.
And she was grieving.
She was grieving.
As she was trying to take care of a newborn.
Yeah.
Totally.
That's really hard.
She said she couldn't, that the baby would cry, she would cry. She said she just was a different.
How long were you, how long was it after your brother's death that you were born?
18 months.
Oh, wow.
18
So
months.
they really decided right away that they wanted another baby.
Right.
Wow. And he had been sick for a while. Do you know the story?
He
Did
hadn't
the
really
family
been sick. He hadn't
share
really
that?
been sick.
Okay.
I think that he probably was weaker than other children, but he did everything. It wasn't like he was laid up in bed or anything like that.
Yeah.
That he was very functional, very bright. I think it was just, one of those things that was very hard.
And did he die suddenly?
He was in the hospital. I'm not sure exactly.
Yeah.
Did they talk about him a lot, Rita, while you were growing up, or no?
Well, first of all, then my father died 18 months after I was born.
Wow.
So I
my
was
goodness.
raised, my mother,
That's a
really
lot of
had
loss.
a lot on her shoulders.
Yeah.
But what happened is because there was not help with grieving, okay, that I wasn't the child that they really wanted. Or, I was the child she wanted. I mean, my mother was wonderful, and I
Now, did
felt
you
very
have other
loved.
siblings? Do you think
I
they
have an
wanted
older
another boy?
half-sister who was an adult by the time I was born.
Oh, wow.
And she was wonderful.
So
know,
you
she
think?
was-
Do you think they wanted a boy?
Yes. Yes, I think they really wanted a replacement because, as I said, if you can have a child in addition to and not instead of, and I think that what happened is just because of the matter of circumstances, it was like, it happened so fast, they couldn't grieve, so they wanted that replacement. So I think that I really was the replacement child.
Wow.
And I was expected to be like him in many ways that I couldn't be.
Yeah, well, let's talk about that. Okay, let's theoretically say you are definitely both replacement children.
Right,
Okay.
right.
And what kind of demands did that put on you? How was that different for you? What were there other demands that you felt that you had?
Well, I think, going back to what Rita was saying, it was not the time when you got grief counseling, and the extent of the grief counseling was have another child.
Right.
And that's exactly what my mother was told, because I know she was in a depression after she lost her child and was taking care of my other sister. And that was the prescription, was have another child. And I know that my father was not that keen on that idea. And he told me that, for years. He said, well, I didn't think we should. He said it was tempting fate, is what he said.
So what he would say to you, well, I didn't think we should have had another child?
He said, well, he was always joking. He was a
okay.
joker. He was very funny. But, he meant it.
But that hurt. Yeah.
So did you
He
feel
meant
like
it.
you had to be really, really good and achieve and be perfect?
I did.
or-
I felt
okay.
like it was kind of on my shoulders,
Yeah.
first of all, to bring some healing.
Oh, okay.
And I think especially to my mother,
Yeah.
but also to my sister.
Yes.
Not
you were
even
a protector in a lot of
I
ways.
was very much her protector, even though she was my older sister.
Yeah.
And not that I didn't want that. I took it on. It was
Yeah.
kind of my identity.
Did she have to wear special clothing and things, or was she not?
When she was younger, she had to wear a brace for a while. But no, it was mostly surgeries that she had. Recovering.
So you lived through a lot of surgeries too.
Oh yeah, every year she would be in the hospital for months. Every year.
And you couldn't create any problems for your parents because they had enough on their plate. It sounds
exactly.
Like.
So I had to be. I had to be kind of
really
the good one that you don't have to worry about ever.
Yes.
You know. So
that's
if
a lot of pressure.
You know, and actually later on, I felt guilty again because I had some illnesses, and that was really not acceptable.
Right.
That I would have something that had to be taken care of.
Because you were supposed to be the low maintenance child.
Right.
The good one, the healing one.
Right.
Okay, yeah.
Right.
And Rita, how were you? How was it for you?
My brother became the saint. You know, and he
sounds familiar,
could
right?
do everything right. So no matter
Yes.
what I was doing, it was, but your brother would have done it this way. Or,
Yes.
you know, it was like, so I sort of like, you know, I kind of resented him at one time, you know, because I felt like, you know, how do you compete with the ghost? You don't. You can't. So it was like, you know, when you keep hearing that, it's like, you know, I was lucky to be a girl. First of all, I was very lucky to be a girl because I think it would have been a lot worse.
Because then you would have been really walking in his shadow.
Right, right.
You hear that a lot with bereaved siblings. I mean,
Right.
my brother died when I was 20, and he was 17. But you hear that, you know, the person that died has been elevated to the status of God,
Right.
and you know we have to compete with that, and they don't do anything wrong because they're no longer here.
Right.
And it's like you said, it's like competing with a ghost.
Well, we have, our book consists of a lot of firsthand stories, and we have that a lot. That we have one boy named Johnny, and his father was saying, like, you know, if he was here, he would have shown you how to do it right because you're not doing it right, you know, all the time,
Yeah.
you know, and this poor kid just never could do it. You know, when he was talking to us about it, I said, you know, this was kind of my story. He said, really? Somebody else has a story like this? And I said, oh, you know, this book really needs to be
It needs to
written.
be told. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, you know, how do you were talking about your daughter that's adopted when we were going to do this show, and how, in a way, she was a replacement for Scott for having my grandson, your son, have a sibling.
Well, yeah, I don't know if she's considered a replacement, but I never thought of it that way. And then I read your books, and talked to you on the radio, and I thought, wait a minute, maybe Samantha kind of fits that a little bit, because I have a son, Alexander, and when I had him, I always knew I was going to give him a sibling. And I had 2 miscarriages and years of infertility. And that was not happening. So in 2006, I flew to China and adopted my daughter. And there's a 7-year age difference between them, and I really, really wanted him to have a sibling. I mean, that's why I brought her, really. And she is a perfectionist.
That's normal.
And I don't know if that has any, you know, hearing what you're saying, I'm like going, wait a minute, there's themes and patterns here that kind of fit who she is. She excels at everything. She's perfect, and she puts a lot of demands on herself, and I don't know.
Well, lots of times that's very normal,
Okay.
and that you don't do it. But the child looks
Right.
around and feels that I'm here and I have got to be perfect because that's my price that I pay for being here. And lots of times it's nothing you're doing at all, but it's very common with a lot of the adult replacement children that I've spoke to who were adopted.
And she knows I had miscarriages. I wanted her, but she knows the history too,
Right.
so that's so interesting.
But she knows you wanted other children that
She
were
does.
yours.
She
and,
does, and
you know, in her
she's-
head,
she's-
even a little child is saying, okay, well, they couldn't have their child, so I'm the second choice.
I'm the replacement
But,
child.
you know,
Right.
as long as the child is celebrated for their own uniqueness, that's what I think is the important
Yeah.
piece.
But she's
you
taking
know.
this on herself, so it's
She
really
really
important
does.
to
And
talk to her about it.
Okay.
She is very unique.
And that she's not a replacement.
Right.
That she's,
Her own person.
yeah,
Right.
she's definitely her own person.
So I was going to ask you guys, for people that are watching this
Yeah.
show, what's your suggestion to them if all of a sudden this is resonating with them and they're thinking, I'm a mom? Let's start out with the mom or dad. What can they do to
I
make it?
think
And I
that-
think dads are important,
Yeah, I think
very important.
that's the first thing. I think is to
be honest.
celebrate them for being who they are.
Yeah.
You know that if they had a sibling, who died. You know, you're like that in this way, but you're so much different and special in this way. You know, and to point that out, and that they are their own person, and they don't have the responsibility to be that other
they
child.
were in addition to the family, not a replacement for anybody. That everybody is special and unique, and nobody replaces anybody else. And I would just say I was led to this. I was led to this wonderful thing that people come in our lives in different ways, and you are. You know, don't make them like special, that my other children are special this way and you're special that way. You have to make everybody kind of come together, that this is a family. Families come together in various ways.
Right.
And, you know, you're just part of the family.
So Judy, were you compared to your sister that died?
I was when I was younger, and I
Okay.
think after I passed the age where she passed away, it stopped a bit. I mean, in the beginning there were some hairstyles that were exactly the same. You know, I had those awful perms that you had to get in the 50s. You know, and I cried and I screamed, and it was the exact same hairstyle. There were some, you know, clothing choices, and I overheard some things from relatives. You know, she's not like her. She's, you know, not as good or whatever it sounded like to me, because I remember that. But later on it changed, and it didn't happen anymore because she was not there.
Right.
And she didn't get beyond that age.
There was no memories of her at that age.
Right.
So there were things that were said where, well, she wouldn't have done it that she wouldn't have done it that way, that you heard as criticism in a way.
I did, yeah.
So let me ask you too, how would you have liked your dads to treat you? Because I think sometimes we focus too much on the women, and there are a lot of women in the grief and loss field.
Well, that's a good
What would you
question.
have wanted from your dad? What if you could say to
Well,
guys
I
out
could take
there?
this one.
Yeah, but my dad died when I was 18 months
Well,
old.
you could
so-
still want something from him.
Well, you know, I had this double, kind of double whammy thing where, because my sister was badly injured, and, you know, physically, and, you know, you could observe the scars. My dad never wanted to say anything about me being, I don't know, pretty or, you know, good or anything, because he felt like it would reflect on my other sister and make her feel bad, which I understand. But he couldn't, and he didn't.
Right.
And he really withheld from me, and I think part of the reason he withheld was because he was afraid also that he was hurt. Now that I understand it a little better, I think he was hurt so badly by losing his daughter that he was afraid to connect with
Because
me.
he was afraid maybe something would happen to you.
I think so.
Yeah.
I do think so.
That makes
And
sense.
another thing too, I think sometimes guys try to protect the women.
Yep,
You
yep.
know, your mother, by not saying too much about you in case you
Yeah.
know, that might remind
I
her
thought
of your
some of
dead
it was
sister,
protective
that kind of thing.
for everybody.
So what would you like for your dad?
Well, you know, I had an older half sister who was like an adult when I came over, and I always felt she was, you know, she saw me for who I was. So I would want that with any parent, that they just saw you and celebrated you for who you were. And so I feel very fortunate in that. And you know, my mother was a very good woman. It wasn't like she was trying to do this. I feel like she was in such grief, and then have the double whammy of my father dying and having her then have to, you know, put a roof over our head, where it, you know, she had not had to do that before. So there were a lot of different things happening at the time. But I was very lucky to have my half sister who was older, who was, you know, a lot of fun, and you know, I just always felt like she saw me for who I was, and I think that was important, that a child, if they're in this situation, needs to find someone who sees them and hears them for who they are. We have a wonderful story by Patty Hahn, Goldie's sister, who was a replacement child, and she said when she was little, she was born 18 months after a boy died. An infant. And she said that she realized that she used to sit with her mother and hold her face. And she said, I never thought she saw me. And I had an aunt who I felt really saw who I was. And she said, I used to think maybe it was because, you know, I needed the attention. She thought when she was older, she said, I thought maybe I needed the attention because I have this famous sister. And she said, but when I look at myself in the place of a replacement child, it makes sense. She also got pregnant very young, had a baby out of wedlock, and in the 50s she was sent away. She wasn't allowed to see the baby. It was taken away from her. She had another one almost in a very short time. So she realizes, and she says this has really helped her heal her life and understand her life.
So I had one more question. Do you, both of you, feel that your parents were more overprotective of you growing up and parented you differently because they had had a child die?
Oh, I do.
I'm not sure.
definitely
My
do.
mother let me do a lot of things. Maybe she was a little more overprotected, but I think because she had to work, she couldn't always be there. So it was a different, relationship.
I think there was a lot of fear, and
Yeah,
with
same
my
here.
parents. Although they pushed themselves, they made themselves let me do things. But I think there was definitely an overprotective.
having a plane fall in your house
Yeah,
is
I mean,
really
it's
like
scary.
You can't protect yourself against that either.
I know.
It's nothing you can do.
Well, what I'm thinking, Heidi, one of the things I'm thinking, and both of you, is that one of the things that we talk about in the grief and loss world sometimes is if you've got a child that you think needs special thing, if you're watching the show and thinking, wow, I may be treating my child differently. If you're in grief, one of the things that Heidi and I always like to suggest is to find support people for your
Absolutely.
kids.
Yep.
And you guys are
Absolutely.
talking about that, an aunt, an uncle. I mean, remember my father-in-law used to take his cousin died, and he used to take his son bowling. That kind of thing. Find people who are going to build up your child because, gosh, if you've just had a loss, 18 months, and maybe had a baby, and you're,
And
get,
just be aware of it.
Yeah.
Be aware of what's happening, that you may be, the parents who have had a loss are survivors.
Right.
And it's not like anybody's a bad guy. It's
Right.
just the whole family is swept into this mess, this cyclone.
Yeah.
And it's just sometimes that you need to say to somebody, if you know someone like that, do you have help? Do you have support? Can I help you figure
Can I
this
hold
out?
your baby?
Yeah, yeah.
Can I take it for a walk in the stroller?
Right.
Right.
So just those kinds of activities are really. Heidi, have you got any thoughts on siblings when you're hearing all this? I mean, replacement children and siblings getting involved.
Well, I think that the one thing is, neither one of you has probably ever been acknowledged as a brave sibling. I don't know. I mean, because you didn't know your sibling,
Right.
I don't even know if you see yourself that way. Do you see yourself as brave siblings?
That's an interesting question. I started to get very involved because when I was talking about replacement children, a lot of the people that I was interviewing were the siblings.
Right.
And we call them the forgotten mourners because they
Absolutely.
really,
They are.
and actually it really made me aware of how they suffered, how the replacement child issue was put on them because they are the forgotten mourners and they
Right.
did not have the help.
Right.
And they tried to
nobody
keep
said,
their
I'm
parents
sorry
together.
you lost your sister
Right.
in a way.
Exactly.
That's right.
Well,
That's
it's time to close the show, and we want to thank you guys for being on.
thank you.
It's
Thank you
been
so much for
great
having
you
us.
on, and congratulations on these wonderful books. And I
Thank
hope
you.
everybody will get one of those books. And Heidi and I thank you for watching the show today. And we want to say to you, as always, if you've lost hope, please lean on ours till you find your own, and God bless.